Come to the floor for the 28th consecutive weeks since the Senate has been in session to once again discuss the war in Ukraine and why it's so important that all of us, the United States, our allies, stand up for Ukraine at this point and provide them the needed military, economic, and humanitarian aid that they need. Over the weekend, I spoke at the annual holiday lunch of the Cleveland area Nationalities Movement. As my colleague from Ohio knows, this was started during the Cold War to advocate for freedom for the former Soviet states. The group today includes people whose families came from all over Eastern Central Europe: Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, of course, Ukraine, and many other countries. All strongly support Ukrainian freedom and the right of Ukraine to chart its own course. At the luncheon, I talked to some of my friends who were there, many of whom have family or friends in Ukraine. We talked about some of the hardships that their relatives and their friends in Ukraine are facing today, and how, as we approach the holiday season here in America, we're thinking about Christmas shopping and putting up decorations and spending time with our family and friends over the holidays. They're thinking about something else. They're thinking about how they can survive. They're thinking about how to stay warm, whether they're going to have running water or electricity. They're living with fear and uncertainty, not knowing when the next Russian missile might strike. The brutal, unprovoked, and illegal invasion of Ukraine has now turned into an outright attack on civilians and non-combatants. This photo is something that we're seeing in communities all over Ukraine. This is some civilian infrastructure. You can see the power grid here, the power lines. This was a result of a Russian missile strike. All over, this is happening. Drones, missiles attacking infrastructure, killing civilians, by the way, and forcing people to live in the dark and in the cold as Ukraine's severe winter weather approaches. Although these merciless Russian attacks are meant to weaken the resolve of Ukrainians, it's not having that effect, actually. I've seen this in my recent trips to Ukraine. It's actually hardening people's resolve. Ukrainians know that these are desperate missile attacks to the interior of the country. Why? Because Russia is losing on the actual battlefield. As this map shows, Ukrainians have shown courage and effectiveness in actually pushing out Russia from all these red areas of Ukraine. This is where Russia was after February 24th. 50% or more of the country has now been liberated by Ukrainian troops. We forget about that. About 55% of Ukraine has now been liberated thanks to the resolve and the courage and the military skill of the Ukrainians. Ukrainian soldiers continue to advance, more slowly, but continue to advance, giving the Russians no time to relax or recover. Here's where we are today. So remember, before there was red all over the country of Ukraine. This is where the Russians are now. This, the striped red line is the part that Russia invaded back in 2014, and the red part here is where they invaded on February 24th and are still occupying parts of Ukraine. In the east, near Bakhmut, which is right here, Russian forces and Wagner Group mercenaries, who are fighting on behalf of Russia, are fighting a war of attrition. It's a grinding war of attrition, with marginal gains to show for their massive losses in terms of manpower and equipment. In its attempt to capture this town of Bakhmut, Russia has turned what used to be a quaint tree-lined city that I visited back in 2018 into a bloodbath. This is what Bakhmut looks like today. It looks like something you'd see out of a World War I film. Ukrainian officials say Moscow is now losing 50 soldiers a day to maintain this slow, bruising advance to reach the city's eastern gates. All of this death and destruction over a city that has marginal strategic advantage for Russia. It appears to observers that Russia's willing to put their soldiers and mercenaries in harm's way in Bakhmut because it's the only place that Russian forces are genuinely advancing at all. And Vladimir Putin is eager, even desperate, to claim some sort of victory to try to salvage this failed military campaign that they're on. I did go to Bakhmut back in 2018. It was then called the Line of Contact. I met with Ukrainian troops who were there, holding the line, including the 54th Mechanized Brigade, who are still fighting there in that region. I saw men willing to die for their country, for their freedom, for their families. So I was not surprised by the bravery and resolve that the Ukrainian troops have shown since February 24th. I was expecting it based on what I had seen in Bakhmut. Those soldiers I met gave me this flag when I was there. It's signed by a number of the soldiers I met, and it says at the bottom here, "Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava." That's the rallying cry. These troops who signed this flag to me, I'm told many of them are likely to be dead or injured now because the fighting in Bakhmut has been so intense. So Godspeed to those troops who are holding the line against this Russian assault tonight as we talk on the floor of the United States Senate. The Ukrainians are making progress elsewhere. You see here in Kherson, this was the city that the Russians took on February 24th. It was the only provincial capital that they took, the biggest city they took early on. They have now abandoned Kherson, and Ukrainian troops have taken Kherson and liberated it. And the liberation has been extraordinary. You see people coming out of their homes and hugging the troops, and you see the war crimes that the Russians were committing. The withdrawal from Kherson to the west side of the river here has been a great victory for the Ukrainian troops. The relentless counteroffensive is actually working. With this situation on the battlefield, the military outlook here for Russia looks bleak. It's precisely because they are not winning on the battlefield, though, that they are instead attacking civilian targets, these cowardly attacks we've seen all over Ukraine. Electricity, natural gas, water, knocking out everything they can in order to try to break the will and the resolve of the people of Ukraine. This past weekend, 1.5 million people were left without power after Russian airstrikes damaged local energy infrastructure in Odessa. So 1.5 million people here were without electricity. Most of those people now have electricity again because the Ukrainians are moving quickly to try to restore it, but then it's bombed again and again. Across the country, according to Ukrainian Prime Minister Shmyhal, quote, "After 8 waves of missile attacks on the country, all thermal and hydroelectric power plants in Ukraine have been damaged." In other words, every single power plant, coal, natural gas, hydroelectric, they have all been bombed. Again, many have now been repaired again and again and again, but the bombings continue. Last Friday, according to the deputy head of President Zelensky's office, 68 strikes in the Kherson region occurred. 68 strikes across the line here in Ukrainian territory. This included a strike on a hospital in Kherson that damaged a children's ward. It included an attack on a morgue in this area. In the northeastern part of Ukraine, up here near Kharkiv, there's also been great progress recently, as you see, where Ukrainians have pushed the Russians toward the east. These Russian cross-border attacks on the city of Volchansk in that area left thousands of people without heat in the midst of winter earlier this week. I saw the effects of these missile attacks firsthand the last time I was in Ukraine. I visited Kyiv about a month ago with my colleague, Senator Chris Coons from Delaware. We saw the destruction that these missiles are causing. In this case, it was at a headquarters of Ukraine's utility company. We then, after that, actually had a dinner meeting with parliamentarians from Ukraine at a restaurant where the power had been taken out through these attacks. We had to conduct business with flashlights. It was incredible later that night to look at the city of Kyiv from an office building, a modern 21st century city, completely dark. Thanks to the dated air defense systems that they do have, the Ukrainians have been able to intercept and destroy a lot of these Russian missiles. So they're intercepting actually most of them, somewhere between 60 and 70% probably, based on the information I have. But enough of them get through to cause this incredible damage to Ukraine's civilian infrastructure and to kill Ukrainians on the ground. as these temperatures drop. The temperature in Kyiv tonight, as we talk here, is about 23 degrees Fahrenheit. Ukraine isn't just trying to shoot down Russian-made missiles and Iranian-made drones. We know that there are Iranian-made drones and these Russian missiles coming in to Ukraine. They also have to shoot down Ukrainian-made missiles. Why do I say that? Because according to Ukraine's deputy intelligence chief, some of these missiles that Russia has fired recently have actually been missiles that Ukraine voluntarily gave to Russia as part of the 1994 Budapest Agreement, the so-called Budapest memorandum. Recall that the Budapest memorandum was a document that was signed by the United States, the UK, and Russia with Ukraine. This was after the fall of the Soviet Union. In the agreement, all parties, including Russia, promised to respect the independence and sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine giving up their nuclear weapons, but also providing missiles and strategic bombers to Russia. So now these very same missiles and very same bombers are being used by Russia in its ruthless campaign against innocent civilians in Ukraine. There can be no clearer display of Russia's contempt for its international obligations and total disregard for the Budapest memorandum. Ukraine gave up its weapons in exchange for peace, and instead they have war. There can be no more urgent or important request from Ukraine today, of course, than a better air defense system. That's what they need more than anything else. Every day, vital infrastructure is being destroyed, civilians being killed. The news from the Biden administration yesterday that they now may be thinking seriously about sending Patriot missile systems to Ukraine, which is our most advanced anti-missile air defense weapon, is very encouraging to me. Here's the Patriot missile system. This one is actually in Poland. We have provided this to the Polish government. We now need to provide it to the Ukrainian government. I've called for this for months, as have others, and I hope this comes to fruition. We need to get these weapons into the hands of the Ukrainians quickly before there are more civilian deaths recorded, before there is more destruction of key infrastructure. If the administration does not do this, I fear as winter sets in, more and more Ukrainians will be forced to leave their communities, compounding the humanitarian crisis that's already there. As you know, there are 6.5 million people displaced internally in Ukraine already, over 7 million people, probably close to 8, who are outside of Ukraine as displaced individuals in places like Poland, throughout the EU, even the United States. I continue to urge the Biden administration to take a more assertive approach on military assistance in general. There are about 50 countries helping Ukraine on the military side. All the free world is stepping up to help, but America leads. And we need to provide Ukraine with more of the weapons that Ukraine says they actually need, like the Patriot missiles. But also they've asked for fourth-generation fighter jets, like the F-16 or similar European models. They're in Europe already. We've provided them to European countries, but we have to sign off for the European countries or other countries to provide them to Ukraine. They want modern main battle tanks, like the Abrams tank that is made in my home state of Ohio. They want more long-range missiles, like the ATACMS missiles that can be fired through these what are called HIMARS launchers and would give Russian soldiers few places to hide in the illegally occupied territory. When I visited the region in March and again in May, in August, and in November, I got to meet a lot of these displaced people in Ukraine and hear their harrowing stories. We were at a World Food UN site in Kyiv in our last trip, and there were a lot of refugees there, displaced people, internally displaced people from Ukraine who were getting the basics just to be able to survive. And many of them sat down with us and talked, and two women told me one of these harrowing stories. It was about a young man who was tortured by his Russian occupiers, and this was near the city of Kharkiv, and taken to the main square and tied up on the main square. And then when he wouldn't answer whatever questions they were asking him, he was taken down below into a dungeon, basically, a basement. And they found these basement chambers all over Ukraine where there was occupied territory. The young man actually survived miraculously. but he was in terrible shape when he came out. But his mother didn't survive. The angst and the anxiety and the despair that she felt about her son resulted in her death. These women were telling this with tears streaming down their cheeks, and of course, we were crying too. But that's happening all over Ukraine. These war crimes behind enemy lines in occupied territories were revealing every time there's a liberation. It's positive there's a liberation, but then you get this negative, which is this is what happened to these people. So we really don't know the extent of the atrocities and the war crimes because there's still so much territory that is occupied by Russia. Anyway, these people have seen death and destruction that no person should have to experience. Some of my constituents in Ohio have been very helpful. They know some of these refugees. They have personal connections, again, family or friends, and so they have helped. And from Northeast Ohio, where we have a big Ukrainian community, Marta Lishanesky of the United Ukrainian Organizations of Ohio and Andy Fute of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, they are presidents of those organizations. They've both jumped in with both feet and helped. MedWish, which is a great organization up in Cleveland, has provided a lot of medical equipment. But they've provided everything, clothes, medicine, any kind of help for these refugees. They've provided armored vests from law enforcement all over Ohio, as an example, to the Territorial Defense Forces. So God bless them. They're doing what they can to help. But unless we intervene with better ways to defend the air, there'll be more and more of these displaced people and more humanitarian needs. So on that front, in addition to the possible news about the Patriot missile system from yesterday, I was also pleased to hear President Biden and President Zelensky spoke over the weekend about the need for increased support for Ukraine. On Friday, the administration announced another $275 million in military assistance, including more ammunition for those HIMARS missile launchers we talked about, and other systems that will counter Russian and Iranian drones. There are dozens of allies who have provided military assistance. We're not doing this alone, but U.S. leadership has been key. By the way, the 20 HIMARS, high-mobility artillery rocket systems that are in Ukraine have all survived. Not a single one has been taken out by the Russians. It's amazing. And the Ukrainians have been quite resourceful to make that happen, and thank God we still have those weapons. Germany and the UK have also provided some of these weapons, and they're making a huge difference on the battlefield. The long range and high precision of these weapons has enabled the Ukrainians to strike deep within the occupied territories to be able to disrupt Russian logistics and command and control centers. That's made the big difference. That's how Kherson was taken, was they cut off the supply chain to Kherson to the point that these soldiers, these Russian soldiers, could not continue to hold the city and continue with their atrocities. It's no wonder, by the way, that HIMARS are popular in Ukraine. In fact, when I was there, the embassy staff sent out for some takeout food. The food came back in a bag. It was hamburgers. And on the bag was scrawled, "Thank you for the HIMARS," from a restaurant worker. I'm also told that HIMARS is now a popular name for Ukrainian newborns. They're naming their children after the weapons provided by this body because they're making a huge difference in saving lives. In addition to the Patriot missiles, we've got to continue to provide Ukrainians with other air defense systems like the mid-range NASAMS system that we're starting to provide, but also cost-effective electronic warfare systems that would enable Ukraine to defend its skies over the long term. Those can be very effective against drones, as you can imagine. You know, we've seen this before. In 1940, the people of Great Britain suffered under a relentless bombardment from Nazi aircraft. Remember, they tried to bomb London into the Stone Age. And at the time, many thought, well, this is going to be the end of Great Britain. You can't push back against these Nazis. But the Brits were resolute. They were defiant. And eventually, the Royal Air Force defeated Hitler's onslaught against innocent civilians in what's called the Battle of Britain and ensured that the country would survive the war. And of course, the United States got engaged. We went on to win that conflict. Today, just as then, there's another indiscriminate bombing campaign going on, this time in Ukraine, against civilians and civilian infrastructure. Ukraine is now fighting its own Battle of Britain. We've got to be sure we're there with them to provide them what they need to survive their battle. I was also pleased to learn this week that the European Union proposed a new round of sanctions. If it is agreed to by the member states, and I hope it will be, this package of sanctions would ban exports of drone engines to Russia and also include other prohibitions that will hopefully stifle Russia's ability to supply its military. This is very important. In my view, it should have happened a long time ago, but let's do it now. Let's cut off the ability for Russia to be able to repair and recreate the drones that are getting destroyed by the Ukrainians. Let's be sure that we're not giving the Russians what they need to continue its war machine. Russia's assault, by the way, is not just limited to bombs and missiles, but I'm hearing more and more about mines. According to reports, Russian forces have now endangered up to 65,000 square miles of Ukrainian territory with landmines. The United States is partnering with our Ukrainian allies to demine that area. This aid has come in the form of training and equipment, as well as U.S.-funded contractors and demining teams. So in areas where the mines are on the Ukrainian side of the line, we are actively trying to help. This is an important step, in my view. It's kind of the first step toward Ukrainian reconstruction. When Russia resorts to these cowardly missile attacks on civilian targets, Ukraine has responded in kind with precise strikes on Russian military targets. So Russia attacking civilian targets, Ukrainians responding with targeted attacks on Russian military targets. For example, explosions have occurred here. This is Ukraine. This is the occupied area. Explosions have occurred deep in Russian territory here. What are those areas? Well, these are Russian air bases deep inside Russian territory, but they are home to the bombers that have been targeting civilian infrastructure and killing Ukrainian civilians with cruise missiles over the past couple of months. As the UK Ministry of Defense reported last week, these may be, and I quote, some of the most strategically significant failures of force protection since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, end quote. Over the weekend, Ukraine launched a series of HIMARS strikes on the Russian-occupied city of Melitopol, which is here, including a strike on Russian military barracks that reportedly killed a lot of the Wagner mercenaries. This is in this area here. America has been blessed with big, wide oceans on our east and to our west, and friendly neighbors to our north and our south. It's hard for us to grasp what they're going through. It's hard for us to grasp what it's like to have a war ravage your homeland and force you to leave your home. Russia's atrocities and clear human rights violations against civilians is one compelling reason why supporting Ukraine is the right thing to do. And I hope this week in this chamber we will once again provide support for Ukraine. But another reason is the death and destruction is not likely to end in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin is on record as saying the borders of Russia have no end. He and his senior officials have also talked about recreating the old Soviet empire. They have said that Ukraine is just the first step. I will tell you, other countries in Eastern Europe get that, and they're understandably quite nervous. That's why they've stepped up big time to help Ukraine. That's why they've increased their own military spending. That's why they've expanded their military cooperation with the United States. Think of Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. They're all doing that. Finland and Sweden certainly understand how dangerous Russia has become, which is why they have now decided they're going to join NATO after years of neutrality. Finland and Sweden. In my view, the only way to get Vladimir Putin to back off and to negotiate an end to this ruthless and senseless war is to continue to demonstrate unity among free nations, to tighten the sanctions on the Russian economy, and to continue to help Ukraine win on the battlefield. That's how this thing ends, through success. U.S. leadership and assistance is key to that strategy. I'm not advocating a blank check, by the way. I hope nobody is. I believe there needs to be accountability for the assistance that we provide, and there is. There's accountability on the state aid, there's accountability on the humanitarian aid, and there's accountability on the military aid. I've seen it in action in meeting with the 101st Airborne in Poland, how they have end-use monitoring of the equipment we're sending. The Ukrainians themselves want to have transparency. They understand how important that is. That's why they have Deloitte, Cincinnati, a American accounting firm involved in monitoring and providing reports. That's why we're running our assistance through the World Bank, where they're auditing and reporting back to us. That's important to do. But the alternative to helping Ukraine, to me, is unthinkable. What would have happened if the United States had said, we're not going to help here? And the rest of the world had said, well, if the Americans aren't going to step forward and provide some leadership, we're not going to either. First of all, it's clear to all of us, this country would be occupied by Russia today. And even if Russia didn't go ahead and move into all these other countries they say they're going to move into, that Ukraine's just the first step and they want to recreate the empire or the Soviet Union, even if it was just Ukraine and they stopped at the Ukrainian borders, suddenly you'd have 3 NATO countries that have a border with Russia who do not now, and really a 4th, because all Poland has is a very small outpost of Russia here. So you'd suddenly have NATO countries. The United States, under Article 5, is committed to protecting with an aggressive Russia on its border. We would be mobilizing thousands of troops. We would have massive amounts of weapons at the borders of these NATO allies at a tremendous cost to the United States taxpayer. Is that a better alternative than helping give Ukraine the tools they need to be able to do their own fighting, which has been successful up to now, more successful than anyone could have imagined? Finally, I would say allowing an authoritarian regime to take over an ally and a democracy with impunity, that sends exactly the wrong message to the rest of the world at a time we can least afford to have that happen. Think about China eyeing a potential military assault in Taiwan. Think about our ally Israel as they continue to face threats from Iran and others in the Middle East. Both our adversaries and our allies are watching to see if the United States and our allies will help maintain that post-World War II world order, or whether it's each country for itself. And if it's each country for itself because we aren't helping in Ukraine, the militarization around the world increases dramatically, as do the nuclear weapons. Ukraine just wants to live in peace with its neighbors, including Russia. But when attacked by Russian missiles and drones, Ukraine has fought to ensure that the flame of freedom here is not going to go out. From visits, I can say with certainty that they will never give up. And we must not give up on them. The Ukrainian people tasted freedom when they embarked on their own revolution of dignity, as they call it, back in 2014. They threw off a Russian-backed corrupt government and instead embraced the West, the European Union, the United States of America, freedom, democracy, free markets. Ukraine chose to stand with us, with Europe, the United States, and other free nations. This is not the time for the United States and its allies to stand down. So for my current colleagues and the senators just elected, I urge you, let's continue our support for Ukraine in this worthy cause of protecting freedom. Thank you, and I yield the floor.